She was 22 years old, and she had 35 cents to her name, a carpet bag with a broken clasp, and a leather satchel that had belonged to her teacher, the only man who had ever believed she was worth teaching. That was everything Opal Sterne carried out of Harwick, Ontario, on the morning of the 3rd of November, 1887. We should tell you something about Harwick before we go any further, because the town matters to this story in the way that a locked door matters. Not for what it holds, but for what it keeps out. Harwick was a mill town, the kind that existed in the shadow of one man's ledger book. That man was Aldred Coombs, not the mayor, not the magistrate, but the owner of the Harwick Timber Company, the grain warehouse, and 3/4 of the rental housing on the east side of the river. He was 61 years old, with a voice like a rusted hinge and the patience of a man who had never once needed to hurry, because everything he wanted had always come to him eventually. Opal had worked as a bookkeeper for Aldred Coombs for 4 years. She had been good at it. Better than good. She had kept the accounts with a precision that the previous bookkeeper, a man named Finch, 20 years older and considerably less careful, had never managed. She had noticed the discrepancies in the 3rd month. She had said nothing about them for a long time, because she was 22 and female and an orphan. And she understood what that combination meant in a town like Harwick. But she had written them down. Everyone. In a small green notebook that she kept in the bottom of her teacher's old satchel, beneath the hand plane, the marking gauge, and the folded paper patterns for dovetail joints. Her teacher had been a cabinet maker. His name was Roland Frey, and he had died of a lung fever the previous January, leaving behind a modest shop on Pine Street, a reputation for the finest joinery work in Simcoe County, and a single apprentice who happened to be a young woman. He had taken Opal on when she was 17, after her mother died and her father's farm was sold to cover debts. He had said on that first morning that he didn't care whether she was a girl or a ghost, as long as she paid attention and kept her tools sharp. She had done both. She had learned to read the grain of wood the way some people read faces. She had learned that a joint made properly didn't need glue to hold. It held because the two pieces fit each other so precisely that there was simply no room for failure. Roland Frey had been a man of very few speeches, but that was the one he made more than once. A good joint doesn't hope to hold. It holds because it has no other choice. When he died, the shop went to his nephew in Hamilton, who had no interest in cabinetry and sold it inside a month. Opal had taken the bookkeeping position with Aldred Coombs because it was the only position available to a young woman without references who was also quietly trying not to starve. And for 4 years, she had done what people in her position always do. She had kept her head down. She had done her work. She had watched. Aldred Coombs, she eventually understood, was stealing from the mill workers. Not clumsily, not in a way that left obvious marks. He had arranged it through the supply accounts, inflating the costs of equipment and deducting the difference from wages under a column he called operational adjustment. The men who worked his saws and his kilns took home less than they had earned, and the amount that was taken grew slowly, year over year, the way a river quietly widens a bank. Not enough to alarm anyone in any single season, but enough over time to change the shape of things entirely. She had written it all down. The mistake she made, the only mistake, she would later tell herself, though there were nights when she was less forgiving, was saying something to Franklin Coombs. Franklin was Aldred's son. He was 30 years old and managed the warehouse, and Opal had believed, for reasons she would spend a long time being embarrassed about, that he was different from his father. He had a way of listening that seemed genuine. He asked questions. He thanked the staff by name. She had trusted that. She had shown him 3 pages of her notes on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, in the quiet of the warehouse office, with the smell of sawdust and cold river air coming through the gap under the door. By Thursday morning, Aldred Coombs had called her into his office. By Thursday afternoon, she was walking out of Harwick with 35 cents and a carpet bag, and the green notebook still in the bottom of Roland Frey's old satchel, which was the only thing Franklin Coombs had not thought to take from her. Perhaps he had not known what it was. Perhaps he had simply not cared. Either way, she had it, and that, though she did not know it yet, was more than anyone intended her to keep. We want you to understand what it meant to be put out of a place like Harwick in November of 1887. There were no trains heading north. The road east toward Barrie was 2 days on foot in fair weather, and something worse than that in the cold. Opal had no family. She had no friends who were not also, in some way, dependent on the Coombs family for their wages or their rent. The woman she had boarded with for the past 3 years, a widow named Mrs. Strang, perfectly decent, perfectly cautious, had handed her the 35 cents herself and avoided her eyes while doing it. "I'm sorry, dear," she had said. "I truly am. But I can't afford the trouble." Opal had nodded. She had not cried. She had been saving that for later, when there was no one around to see it. She walked east. The first night she spent in the barn of a farm family named Desjardins, whose wife took one look at her on the doorstep and said nothing at all, just pointed toward the barn and brought her a bowl of potato soup and half a loaf of bread an hour later. No questions. Opal ate every bit of it sitting on a hay bale with Roland Frey's satchel in her lap, and the hand plane cold against her fingers through the leather. And that was when she cried. Quietly, thoroughly, with the sound of the wind in the barn roof and the soft breathing of two old horses somewhere in the dark. She wasn't crying about Harwick. She had already made her peace with leaving Harwick. She was crying because she had trusted the wrong person, and she was 22, and she had thought, somehow, that her work would be enough to protect her. It had not been enough. Work, she was learning, was never enough on its own. You also needed someone in the right position to see the value of what you did. And the people in the right positions, she was learning, very rarely had any incentive to see it. In the morning she thanked Mrs. Desjardins and continued east. She reached the town of Larkin's Crossing 2 days later, cold and footsore and with 20 cents left. She had spent 15 at a general store in a crossroads village whose name she never learned, on a tin of sardines and a pair of dry socks. Larkin's Crossing was not much: a grain elevator, a post office, a Methodist church, a blacksmith's, 4 streets of houses, and a hotel that also functioned as a tavern. But it had a general store with a notice board, and on the notice board there was a card that read, "Carpenter wanted. Light repairs. Property on the Braeburn Road, 6 miles north. Inquire within." She inquired within. The store was run by a man named Orville Tench, who was perhaps 50, and had the unhurried quality of a man who had long since made his peace with the pace of things. He looked at her over his reading glasses when she asked about the card. He looked at the satchel. He looked back at her. "You a carpenter?" "Cabinetmaker," she said. "Apprenticed 4 years under Roland Frey of Harwick. He's passed now." "Frey's," said Orville Tench. He said the name the way people say the names of things they remember well. "I bought a sideboard from Roland Frey once. Still have it. Best piece of furniture I own." "He was the best I ever saw," Opal said, and meant it. Orville Tench looked at her for a moment longer, then took off his reading glasses, folded them, put them in his vest pocket, and said, "The property belongs to the Harker estate. Old Silas Harker died 2 springs ago, left the place to nobody in particular. He had a falling out with his family 30 years back and never resolved it. The county's been trying to settle the estate. In the meantime, the buildings are sitting empty and falling apart. There's a township arrangement that allows a person to live on an unclaimed property and maintain it, and in exchange the county doesn't collect whatever small maintenance fee they'd otherwise be owed. You'd have to do the work yourself." "What kind of work?" "Roof's leaking in 3 places, from what I hear. Floor of the main room is soft near the east wall. Window frame in the kitchen is so warped the window won't close. Whoever fixes those things can live there free through the winter, and possibly longer if the estate situation isn't resolved." Opal thought about this. 6 miles north on the Braeburn Road meant 6 miles from anywhere. It meant a winter alone in a house she'd never seen, in a county she didn't know, fixing a leaking roof with 20 cents to her name. She thought about the alternative, which was continuing east on a road to somewhere she had even less reason to trust. "I'll need supplies," she said. "I don't have much money right now, but I'm a careful worker and I'll pay you back." Orville Tench looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Frey's work holds. If you learned from him, I'll extend you credit. Within reason." She was on the Braeburn Road by noon. The house was worse than she'd expected, which she had also expected. 6 miles north, and up a long sloping lane that climbed through stands of birch and tamarack. The building sat on a cleared rise with a view of a frozen pond to the west, and a woodlot thick with spruce to the north. It had been a good farm once. You could see it in the bones. The careful placement of the outbuildings, the stone foundation walls, the old orchard behind the barn, gnarled and unpruned but still standing. The house itself was 2 stories, clad in gray cedar shingles, with a covered porch that had a rotten board in the middle of the second step, and a front door that opened inward with the cautious groan of a thing that hadn't been used in 2 years. Inside it smelled of cold and dust, and faintly, of pipe tobacco, a ghost of the man who had lived here alone for 30 years, by all accounts, and died here alone as well. Opal set her carpet bag down in the hall. She set Roland Frey's satchel on the kitchen table. She walked through every room, slowly the way he had taught her to assess a piece of wood before cutting it. Looking for the grain, looking for the flaws, looking for where the strength was and where it wasn't. The roof needed work, yes. The east wall floor was soft near the corner. She pushed on it with her boot and felt it give, not catastrophically but enough. The kitchen window frame was warped half off its hinge. The chimney flashing had come loose on the south side, which explained the stain on the parlor ceiling. She also noticed something else, though she didn't give it much thought that first afternoon. There was a room off the kitchen, a small room, barely larger than a pantry, with a low door and a floor of fitted stone rather than wood planks. It was clearly old, older than the rest of the house. The walls were fieldstone. There was a second small hearth built into the north wall, separate from the kitchen fireplace, and in the corner, barely visible beneath decades of dust and a half-collapsed shelving unit, was a section of floor that didn't quite match the rest. She noted it and moved on. There was too much work to be done before the next snowfall to spend time on oddities. She spent the first week on the roof. She had never done roofing before, precisely, but she understood the principles. Water moves downhill, and everything else is a problem of overlap and seal. She borrowed a ladder from the Desjardins farm, which she passed on her way back from Orville Tench's store, and Mrs. Desjardins' eldest son, a quiet young man named Bertrand, helped her carry supplies up the lane without being asked or thanked, both of which she appreciated. She patched the 3 leaks with rolled roofing and new flishing, sealed the chimney joint with tar and gravel, and felt the deep, clean satisfaction that had always come to her from making something watertight. She relaid the soft floorboards herself, pulling each one up carefully to check the joists beneath. 2 joists needed sistering, new boards nailed alongside to reinforce the weakened old ones. She had the materials from Tench's store on credit, and she was careful with every inch of them, cutting nothing she could avoid cutting. The kitchen window she rebuilt from the frame out, which took the better part of 3 days because the sill had rotted below the visible surface and she had to replace it entirely. When she was finished, the window opened and closed with the precise, unhurried ease of something made to last another 50 years. She slept in the upstairs bedroom and ate simply. She had established a small credit arrangement with Orville Tench that she managed with the same precision she had once applied to Aldred Coombs's accounts. She was careful, she was cold, often, she was alone. But the work was honest, and the house was beginning, slowly, to become something that answered her effort. It was the 3rd week of November when she went back to the small stone room. She had been looking for a place to store the offcuts of lumber she'd accumulated. Not enough to be wasteful, too much to leave out in the weather. The stone room was the logical answer. She started clearing the shelving unit from the corner, piece by piece, setting the broken boards outside. That was when she saw it clearly. The mismatched floor section was roughly 18 inches square, fitted with a different stone, flatter, thinner, almost like a flagstone set flush with the others rather than the thick irregular pieces around it. It had an iron ring, small and dark with age, set into one edge. Opal sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long moment. She thought about not lifting it. She thought about it quite carefully. In fact, the way Roland Frey had taught her to think about a joint before committing to the cut. Once you pull a ring like that, you can't unpull it. Whatever is underneath becomes something you know. She pulled the ring. The stone came up with the reluctant scrape of something that had not moved in many years. Beneath it were 3 stone steps going down into a small cavity, roughly 4 feet square and perhaps 3 feet deep. More of an alcove than a cellar. Cool, dry, completely dark. She went and found her lamp. There were 4 things in the cavity. The first was a tin box, military issue, the kind used for dispatches or correspondence, with the initials DH stamped on the lid. The second was a cloth-wrapped bundle, secured with twine. The third was a bottle of rye whiskey, still sealed, which she set aside without opening. The fourth was a leather notebook, its cover warped but intact, with the words S. Harker, Private, written on the front in a precise small hand. She sat on the stone floor with the lamp between her knees and opened the tin box first. There were letters inside, a dozen of them, perhaps more. They were written on paper that had once been fine, and was now yellowed and soft at the edges. The handwriting was hurried in some, careful in others. She read the first 3 before she understood what she was holding. The letters were from a man named Captain Douglas Harker. She would learn later that he was Silas Harker's younger brother, who had gone east to fight in the Fenian troubles of 1866 and never fully come home in spirit, even when he came home in body. The letters were addressed to Silas. They were about land. Specifically, They were about a parcel of land, 340 acres along the north branch of the Braeburn Creek, which Silas Harker had purchased with Douglas's money and was supposed to hold in joint names until Douglas returned. According to the letters, increasingly urgent, increasingly angry over a span of several years, Douglas had come back to find the deed filed in Silas's name alone. She set the letters down carefully and opened the leather notebook. It took her an hour to read it through. Silas Harker had been a meticulous man, whatever else he was. The notebook was an account of his life, written in the kind of plain, unsparing prose that people use when they are writing for their own record rather than for an audience. And partway through, she could see the date, 1874. The tone shifted. He wrote about his brother. He wrote about the land. He wrote that he had told Douglas, when Douglas came to claim his share, that the deed was lost, that a fire in the county office had destroyed the records, that there was nothing to be done. None of that was true, and Silas Harker knew it. He wrote about it with the particular weariness of a man who has carried a wrong for a long time and is trying to understand it rather than excuse it. He had wanted the land. He had been afraid of losing it. He had lied, and Douglas had eventually given up and gone away, and the years had passed, and the guilt had stayed, and he had put the letters and his own notebook in a box, in the floor of the old stone room, and lived above them for 30 years. The cloth-wrapped bundle was the deed, 2 copies folded together, one in Silas's name alone, and below it, handwritten on separate paper and dated 1866, the original agreement between the brothers, signed by both, witnessed by a man named Aldous Vane, Justice of the Peace, Simcoe County. She sat in that cold stone room for a long time. She thought about what she had. She thought about what it meant. 340 acres along the Braeburn Creek, with mineral rights and water rights listed in the original agreement. Rights that, if Douglas Harker had any descendants still living, belonged to them by the letter of what she was reading. She thought about what she had learned in 4 years of watching Aldred Coombs, which was that property did not right itself. Land did not find its way back to the people it belonged to on its own. Someone had to carry the thing forward, and she thought about the green notebook, still in the bottom of Roland Frey's satchel. She thought about it for a very long time. She found Douglas Harker's family through Orville Tench, who knew everything and said very little of it without reason, but who, when Opal came into the store on a Tuesday morning in December and laid the tin box on his counter and told him what she'd found, went very still for a moment and then said, "Douglas had a daughter. She married a Quenville. There's still Quenville people in Penetanguishene. How would I reach them?" "I'd write a letter," Tench said, "and I'd find a county solicitor to look at what you have before you sent it." She wrote 2 letters. The first was to a solicitor in Barry named James Sutherland, whose name appeared on several legal notices pinned to the board in the post office. The second was to Madeline Kenville of Penetanguishene, whose address Orville Tench provided without further commentary. Then she sat down and wrote a 3rd letter. This one was to the Simcoe County Land Registry and the Regional Superintendent of Labor, and it contained 14 pages of carefully transcribed figures from her green notebook. 4 years of operational adjustments applied to the wages of the men who worked the Harwick Timber Company's saws and kilns. She cited dates. She cited amounts. She cited the relevant sections of the Ontario Factories Act of 1884. She had looked them up in a volume at Orville Tench's store, which, it turned out, also functioned as something of an informal lending library. She sent all 3 letters on the same day, in the same trip to the post office, and then she walked back up the Braeburn Road in 6 inches of new snow and went back to work. We want to tell you what came next, but we also want you to understand that it did not come quickly. Things like this rarely do. Justice, when it moves the way a frozen river begins to thaw. Not all at once, not visibly at first, but steadily. And then one morning you notice the water is flowing again, and you realize it must have been moving underneath for some time. James Sutherland, the Barry solicitor, wrote back in 2 weeks. He had reviewed the documents she described. He wished to see the originals. He believed, based on her description, that the case was worth pursuing, and that the existence of the original 1866 agreement, witnessed and dated, made it a matter less of litigation than of correction. The kind of clerical wrong that courts in Ontario had, in recent years, shown some willingness to address. The labor complaint took longer. The county superintendent wrote back in January formally, with the bureaucratic caution of a man who understood that Aldred Coombs was a significant presence in the region. But the figures were in the letter. The figures were correct, and Opal had written everything down in the kind of precise, legible hand that made it very difficult for anyone to claim they hadn't understood. The investigation into the Harwick Timber Company's wage practices was announced in the Barrie Examiner in the second week of February. We are told that Aldred Coombs received the notice in the Harwick post office, and that his face went the particular color of a man who has spent a long time believing himself untouchable and has just discovered he is not. Franklin Coombs, his son, resigned his position at the warehouse the following week and moved to Toronto, which is the kind of quiet conclusion that suits certain people better than a public one. The men who worked the Harwick mills were awarded back wages in the spring. Not all of what was owed, because these things never fully correct themselves, but enough for the settlement to be described in the newspaper as substantial. Aldred Coombs was required to divest himself of 2 properties and pay a fine that, by the county's account, was proportionate. He did not go to prison. That is the part of the story we find hardest to conclude, and we will not pretend otherwise. But the Harwick Timber Company was sold the following year to a workers' cooperative, organized by a group of the senior millmen, with financing arranged in part through the Mechanics' Institute in Barrie. The cooperative ran the mill for the next 22 years. It was not a perfect operation, but it was theirs. Madeleine Quenneville came to Larkin's Crossing in March. She was 54 years old, with Douglas Harker's precise handwriting and her mother's patience, and she arrived by sleigh with her eldest son and a look on her face of someone who has received an unlikely letter and traveled a long distance because the contents were too strange and too important to respond to any other way. Opal met her at Orville Tench's store. They sat in the back room by the stove, with the tin box and the documents laid out on the table between them, and Madeleine Quenneville read every letter her grandfather had written in his own hand to the brother who had betrayed him. She read them slowly. She set each one down with the particular carefulness of someone who knows they are holding something irreplaceable. When she was finished, she looked up at Opal and said, "Why did you do this? You could have said nothing. The house was yours to use regardless." Opal thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "My teacher used to say that a joint either fits or it doesn't. You can't make a wrong cut right by leaving it in the wall and hoping no one notices. Sooner or later, the whole piece fails." Madeleine Quenneville looked at her for a long time. "Are you a carpenter?" "Cabinetmaker," Opal said. "I'm looking for a shop." The Quenneville family, as it turned out, owned a building in Penetanguishene that had last been used as a harness shop and had stood empty for 3 years. It had good light, a solid floor, and a storage room in the back with enough space for a proper lumber rack. The 340 acres along the Braeburn Creek were transferred, through James Sutherland's careful work, to Madeleine Quenneville and her heirs in the summer of 1888. A portion of the mineral rights generated a modest lease income over the following years. Not a fortune. Enough. The shop that Opal Sterne opened on Penetanguishene's Main Street in the autumn of that same year was called Frey & Co., the name she had chosen months earlier. On a night in January, when the wind came off the frozen pond and rattled the repaired window frame, and she had sat by the kitchen hearth with the hand plane in her lap, thinking of the man who had given it to her. She was known, in that town, for the precision of her joinery, and for the fact that she could read a client's wood before they could, and for the way she ran her shop. 2 apprentices, eventually, one of whom was a girl of 15 who came in one afternoon asking for work and left with an apron and a lesson in how to sharpen a chisel. There is a sideboard in a house in Penetanguishene, made of white oak with hand-cut dovetail joints, that still stands exactly as it was made. And if you know what you're looking at, you can see in the fit of those joints what Roland Frey taught and what Opal Sterne carried forward. The idea that the right fit doesn't need anything extra to hold. It holds because it was made that way. We think about that sometimes when we tell stories like this one, about the people who are handed 35 cents in a broken bag and told to disappear, and who disappear not into nothing, but into something no one expected. About the things we carry from the people who believed in us. About what it means to put a wrong thing right, not because it benefits you, but because the piece simply won't hold otherwise. We wonder sometimes if you've carried something like that. A tool, a lesson, a way of seeing the work that someone else gave you before they were gone. What did they teach you that stayed?